On September 29, 1944, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Ocean area, and Fleet Admiral Ernest King, chief of United States naval operations, met in San Francisco to discuss the next steps for delivering the final blow to Japan. While the stated purpose of the conference was to strategize this operation, the unspoken goal was to convince the often inflexible King to accept Nimitz's battle plan over his own. This would be a challenging task, as King, tall and lean with a hard demeanor, was known for his toughness, so much so that his civilian chief of the Navy, Frank Knox, had ordered a silver miniature blowtorch from Tiffany's engraved with that very sentiment. Nimitz and his senior Army chiefs, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner of Army Ground Forces, Pacific Ocean Area, and Lieutenant General Millard Harmon of the newly formed Army Air Forces, were apprehensive about the meeting. They were aware that King favored landing operations on the large island of Formosa, located off the southeastern coast of China. If Nimitz and his staff could persuade King to adopt General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur's plan to invade Luzon in the Philippines instead of Formosa, the conference could end on a note of rare inter-service cooperation. Each of the conferees was assigned a luxurious suite at the Elegant Saint Francis Hotel, convening in Admiral King's opulent quarters for 3 days of discussions. During this time, they enjoyed Epicurean meals not typically found on the wartime menu. In the quieter setting of the Pacific Ocean area's headquarters, Nimitz presented a meticulously drawn memorandum showcasing his well-known attention to detail with a calm demeanor that masked his inner apprehension. The pink-cheeked, white-haired, baby-faced Nimitz carefully refrained from provoking the stern-faced, short-fused admiral while explaining why King's preferred invasion of Formosa was not feasible at that moment. First, the Japanese had stationed a full-field army on Formosa, then known as Taiwan, which was far too strong for the American forces currently available in the Pacific. This point was vigorously supported by both Buckner and Harmon. Second, based on the U.S. losses of 177,000 dead and wounded during the campaign to eliminate 32,000 dug-in Japanese forces on the island of Saipan, the casualty estimate for a Formosa invasion could exceed 150,000. Such slaughter was beyond what the Pacific Ocean area's resources could sustain, and the American public would never accept it. In contrast, MacArthur had predicted that Luzon could be captured with comparatively moderate casualties. Throughout this presentation, Ernest King's face remained stony, although it's possible that at the mention of Douglas MacArthur's name, one of his eyelids might have flickered. Nimitz, however, was prepared for this moment. He had long understood that one cannot take without giving. He proposed an alternative to King's plan. If King agreed to MacArthur's liberation of Luzon and the recapture of Manila, these victories would clear the way for a direct invasion of Japan's home islands by capturing Iwo Jima and Okinawa to serve as staging areas. As Nimitz continued, King's eyebrows rose in interest. This plan would completely sever Japan's access to its oil sources in Borneo, Sumatra, and Burma. Without these vital resources, Japan's fleets could not sail, its airplanes could not fly, and its industries could not function. Furthermore, from Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the massive B-29s could intensify their bombardment of Japan, potentially forcing the country into submission without the need for an invasion. Admiral King listened intently, posing tough, decisive questions. He acknowledged having read a Joint Chiefs report questioning the feasibility of invading Formosa, though he expressed some skepticism about attacking Iwo Jima, which was only 760 miles from Japan and within the Tokyo prefecture. Turning to Admiral Spruance, who had previously advocated for an attack on Okinawa, King asked if he had anything to add, reminding him that he had once described Okinawa as his baby. Spruance, never one to position himself between competing commands, replied that Nimitz had summarized the situation well and had nothing further to contribute. To their surprise, Admiral King graciously agreed to substitute Iwo Jima and Okinawa for his preferred Formosa plan, even if it meant postponing his eagerness to assist China. This proposal likely appealed to King as it deferred the politically sensitive issue of who would be the supreme Allied commander in the Pacific, Nimitz or MacArthur. For years, MacArthur had aggressively pursued this title, almost obsessively envious of the Supreme Allied Commander title held by his former aide Dwight Eisenhower in the European theater. He had cultivated the support of influential politicians and the conservative press, stopping only when a frustrated Franklin Delano Roosevelt informed him that if the Pacific were to have a supreme commander, it would be Nimitz. King may have reasoned that this decision, sure to be unpopular with both sides of the Army-Navy rivalry in World War II, could be postponed until the actual invasion of Japan, if such an operation were to occur. Both Nimitz and King dreaded the horrific carnage, on both American and Japanese sides, that could ensue from such an attempt. As sailors, they understood perhaps better than the perpetually optimistic MacArthur the dire consequences of a failed amphibious operation. Thus, the San Francisco conference concluded on a positive note, with King returning to Washington to report his approval to the Joint Chiefs, while Nimitz and his flag officers returned to Hawaii to plan the new operations, particularly for Iwo Jima and Iceberg, the code name for Okinawa. Okinawa is situated at the midpoint of the Ryukyu Islands, roughly equidistant between Formosa, Taiwan, 500 nautical miles to the southwest, and Kyushu, 375 miles to the north. In ancient times, Okinawa was a dependency of China, paying annual tribute to the imperial court in Peking. The group of islands was called Liuqiu, a term meaning pendant ball or bubbles floating on water in Chinese. However, following their annexation by Japan in 1879, their new rulers, struggling to pronounce the L sound, renamed them Ryukyu. These islands lie southwest of Japan, northeast of Formosa and the Philippines, and west of the Bonin Islands, which include Iwo Jima, the peaks of Drowned Mountains. They stretch in an arc approximately 790 miles long between Kyushu and Formosa, with the Okinawa group at the center, comprising around 50 islands. The largest island, Okinawa, is 60 miles long and generally runs north to south, ranging from 2 to 18 miles wide, covering a total area of 485 square miles. Given its proximity to Japan, Okinawa could support numerous airfields, divisions, and warships, anchored in the extensive Haoshi anchorage off the west coast, or the equally valuable Nakagusuku Bay off the southeast shore. This would serve as a crucial staging area for the Allied invasion of Europe, essentially the waterborne assault on Japan in 1945. In 1945, Okinawa had a population of approximately 500,000, with around 60% residing in the southern third of the island, a region more hospitable than the rugged northern area. The Okinawans, originally resembling Japanese, had experienced an influx of Malay, Chinese, Mongolian, and other ethnic groups, resulting in a smaller stature and fuller faces compared to their northern rulers. They were also among the most docile people in the world, lacking any history of war, having neither manufactured nor carried arms. Napoleon, upon learning of this fact, was indignant. Although figures like Jesus, Allah, and Confucius visited Okinawa, their missionaries succeeded in converting few, if any, natives away from their primitive animist beliefs, which revolved around a mystical reverence for fire, hearth, and the worship of ancestral bones. These remains were stored in sizable, ladder-shaped tombs, which the Japanese, with their customary indifference to other cultures, began fortifying with machine guns and cannons as the war broke out. At the onset of the conflict, Okinawa's standard of living was low, and the Japanese made no effort to improve it. Generally, the Japanese despised the Okinawans, viewing them as inferior and useful only as laborers for their small-scale farms, which supplied sugarcane, sweet potatoes, rice, and soybeans to Japanese troops. Aside from teachers trained in Japan, most Okinawans, akin to the American Indians, showed little desire to embrace industrial society, preferring to live as their ancestors had in small villages of about 100 people or towns of 1,000. Despite the Japanese's contempt, many young Okinawan men were conscripted into their militia. On the whole, the Japanese troops in the Ryukyu Islands were met with quiet and sullen resentment, reminiscent of early American colonists' attitudes toward British redcoats quartered in their homes. Although the Japanese and Okinawan languages share similarities, they are not mutually intelligible. The southern third of the island, below Ishikawa, where most of the fighting would occur, consists of rolling, hilly terrain that is lower than the mountainous and rugged northern region. However, it is considerably easier to defend, featuring steep natural escarpments, ravines, terraces, and numerous caves aligned generally east and west across the island. This landscape would present significant challenges for any attacking force, necessitating difficult crosshatch fighting without clear north-south navigation. The question of who would serve as the supreme Allied commander in the Pacific, Nimitz or MacArthur, had been a topic of contention for years. Douglas MacArthur was fiercely ambitious, driven by jealousy over the title held by his former aide Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in the European theater. In his quest for power, MacArthur sought support from influential politicians and the conservative press, only pausing when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, frustrated with his insistence, declared that if the Pacific were to have a supreme commander, it would be Nimitz. Admiral Ernest King may have reasoned that delaying his decision, one likely to be unpopular with both sides amid the Army-Navy rivalry of World War II, would allow for more strategic planning leading up to the actual invasion of Japan, should such an operation occur. Both Nimitz and King dreaded the potential carnage that could arise from a failed amphibious operation, understanding the stakes far better than the ever-optimistic MacArthur. Consequently, the San Francisco conference concluded on a positive note, with King returning to Washington to report his approval to his fellow Joint Chiefs, while Nimitz and his flag officers returned to Hawaii to strategize for upcoming operations, particularly for Operation Iceberg, the code name for the Okinawa campaign. Okinawa is situated at the midpoint of the Ryukyu Islands, approximately 500 nautical miles southwest of Formosa, Taiwan, and 375 miles north of Kyushu. Historically, Okinawa was a dependency of China, paying annual tribute to the imperial court. The islands were originally known as Luqiu, a Chinese term meaning pendant ball or bubbles floating on water. After Japan annexed the islands in 1879, their new rulers, who struggled to pronounce the L sound, renamed them Ryukyu. The islands lie southwest of Japan proper, northeast of Formosa and the Philippines, and west of the Bonin Islands, which include Iwo Jima. They stretch in an arc about 790 miles long between Kyushu and Formosa, with the Okinawa group of approximately 50 islands clustered around its largest island. Okinawa, which measures 60 miles long, runs generally north to south, and varies in width from 2 to 18 miles, covering 485 square miles. Okinawa's strategic location enabled it to support numerous airfields and military divisions, with various warships anchored in the expansive Haoshi anchorage off the west coast or the equally significant Nakagusuku Bay on the southeast shore. It was poised to become a crucial staging area for the Allied invasion of Japan in 1945, similar to the role of England in the invasion of Europe. At that time, Okinawa had a population of about 500,000, with roughly 60% residing in the more hospitable southern third of the island, as opposed to the rugged northern region above the Ishikawa Isthmus. Originally, Okinawans resembled the Japanese, but an influx of Malay, Chinese, Mongol, and other ethnic groups over time resulted in them being smaller and rounder-faced than their northern masters. They were among the most docile people globally, with no history of warfare, neither making nor carrying weapons. This fact reportedly astonished Napoleon when he learned it. Although various missionaries, including those of Jesus, Allah, and Confucius, visited Okinawa, few natives renounced their primitive animist beliefs, which included a mystical reverence for fire and hearth, as well as the worship of their ancestors' bones. These remains were kept in large lyre-shaped tombs that the Japanese, showing their customary indifference to other cultures, fortified with machine guns and cannons at the onset of war. Before the war, Okinawans lived in low standards of living, and the Japanese made no effort to improve their conditions. The Japanese often regarded Okinawans as inferior and viewed them primarily as laborers, utilizing their small-scale farms to supply food, such as sugar cane, sweet potatoes, rice, and soybeans. Aside from a few trained teachers, most Okinawans, similar to the Native Americans in the U.S., had little desire to embrace industrial society, preferring the traditional lifestyles of their ancestors in small villages of about 100 people or larger towns of around 1,000. Despite their contempt, the Japanese had conscripted many young Okinawan males into their military. Consequently, Japanese troops in the Ryukyu Islands were met with quiet resentment, akin to the early American colonists' feelings towards British soldiers stationed in their homes. While the Japanese and Okinawan languages share similarities, they are mutually unintelligible. The southern third of Okinawa, below the Ishikawa area where most of the fighting would occur, consists of rolling hills that are easier to defend than the rugged northern terrain. The landscape features steep natural escarpments, ravines, terraces, and ridges with numerous natural caves aligned east-west across the island. This geography meant that any attacking force would face considerable challenges, engaging in difficult crosshatch fighting. There were no north-south ridges or river valleys to facilitate troop movement, making it essential for American forces moving south to overcome a series of heavily fortified east-west ridges. Each time one ridge fell, a new one would present another obstacle. The only two-way road in the southern region ran through the Naha-Shuri area, with Naha serving as the commercial center and Shuri as the ancient capital of Okinawa. Even these routes became impassable during torrential rains, which frequently inundated the entire island, leaving only the higher elevations above water. Limestone ridges turned into a sea of mud, and the skies over the Great Ryukyu Islands were capable of unleashing 11 inches of rainfall in a single day. The humidity was so oppressive that it rivaled even the conditions in Itria or the Belgian Congo. An American soldier once remarked that Okinawa had an excellent network of bad roads. Shuri Castle was the focal point of Okinawa's defensive strategy, situated on high ground overlooking Naha to the east. Beneath it, an ancient cave system was being extended and fortified to create a bomb and shell-proof headquarters for the Japanese 32nd Army. Heavy artillery placed nearby could bombard any part of southern Okinawa. If the Americans managed to penetrate Shuri's outer defenses, the Japanese defenders could retreat to the center of the island as long as Shuri remained unconquered. These fortifications resembled the blood-soaked caves and fissures of Pelu, a drowned coral mountain that had risen above the sea, but they were man-made. The soft coral and limestone could be excavated with pick and shovel, and small natural caves could be expanded to accommodate as many as 200 men. The excavated material was useful for building barricades that, when soaked with water and baked by the sun, became almost as hard as concrete. However, while Pelu measured only 6 miles long by 2 miles wide, southern Okinawa spanned about 20 miles in length, and in some areas was 18 miles wide. This was the daunting fortified terrain that awaited the Americans when they landed in the spring of 1945. For the United States Navy, the situation was further complicated by the introduction of the kamikaze, a new and terrifying weapon. Neither the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters nor the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff anticipated that Okinawa would be the last battle of World War II. This oversight stemmed from a history of misjudgments. The Joint Chiefs had initially underestimated the enemy's striking power at the beginning of the Pacific War, and subsequently overestimated it as the conflict progressed. However, some astute Okinawans were already privately reassuring one another that Nippon ga Maka, Japan is finished, in early 1945. After the capture of Iwo Jima by 3 Marine divisions, Japan, now vulnerable to aerial and submarine assaults, had been almost entirely cut off from its seized Pacific Empire. The Philippines had been invaded by an American amphibious force under General Douglas MacArthur the previous October, while in the same month the United States Navy had decimated the remnants of the once mighty Japanese Navy during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. On January 9th, Luzon in the Philippines was invaded, and from February 16th to 17th, the fast carriers of the United States Navy launched their first naval air raids on Tokyo Bay, resembling a typhoon of steel. A week later, American forces overran Manila, and in late March, Iwo Jima fell to 3 Marine divisions in one of the bloodiest battles in American military history. Not only did the historic flag raising atop Mount Suribachi enshrine old glory in American military lore, but the capture of this seemingly insignificant island, just 4.5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide, was strategically vital and heightened Japanese fears. This victory guaranteed that the devastating raids on Japan by the new B-29 Superfortress bombers of the United States Army Air Forces would continue and escalate. Iwo Jima became a base from which these bombers could strike closer to the Japanese capital without detection, protected by American fighter planes stationed on the island. Moreover, the capture of Iwo Jima was a boon for these brave airmen. Crippled B-29s unable to make the 1,500-mile flight back to Saipan could now land safely on the tiny island. If shot down near Japan, they could be reached by rescue planes stationed on Iwo Jima. Thus, these costly aircraft could be saved, along with their invaluable crews. On the night of March 9th, the superfortresses began proving their worth by launching devastating strikes against Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. In massive raids involving 300 planes, they descended to 6,000 feet over Tokyo to unleash firebombs that consumed 250,000 houses and left 1 million people homeless, while resulting in the deaths of 83,000 individuals in the deadliest air raid in history. These air raids caused more death and destruction than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that would follow. Meanwhile, the vast Japanese merchant fleet was engaged in transporting vital oil and minerals to an empire notably lacking in natural resources. This fleet had been systematically destroyed by the torpedoes of the United States Navy's submarines. Here indeed were the unsung heroes of the prolonged conflict in the Pacific, a 3-year campaign spanning 4,000 miles from Pearl Harbor to the reef-rimmed slender Long Island of Okinawa. These men of the Silent Service played a crucial role in the war effort. The Japanese, as they were called, often joked about how they had divided the Pacific between themselves and the enemy, granting Japan the bottom half. This was somewhat true, as only occasional supply ships or transports arrived at or departed from Japan's numerous seaports, which now lay in ghostly silence. Remarkably, American submarines had penetrated Japan's inland seas, systematically dismantling its ferry traffic. Transportation on the 4 home islands, Honshu, Shikoku, Kyushu, and Hokkaido, had come to a standstill, with little movement occurring by road, rail, sea, or air. Within the imperial palace, hissing and bowing members of the household staff shielded Emperor Hirohito from the shocking and grim protests arriving in the Daily Mail, letters from Japanese fathers who had lost too many sons to the redhead barbarians. Most of these dissenters remained silent and anonymous, fearing a visit from the warlord's dreaded thought police. Many were men who had lived and worked in America, recognizing it as the unrivaled industrial giant that it was. They did not share the general jubilation surrounding the emperor's glorious young pilots who had returned home from Pearl Harbor. Instead, their hearts were filled with trepidation and dread for the retribution that awaited their beloved country. For 8 months following Pearl Harbor, victory fever had gripped Japan. During that time, the striking power of America's Pacific Fleet had surged forward, and the Japanese flag flew triumphantly over Guam, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. It overshadowed the French tricolor in Indochina and extinguished the Union Jack in Singapore, where columns of short tan men in mushroom helmets marched through silent streets. Burma and Malaya also fell to Japanese control, and the hundreds of millions in India were endangered. Great China was nearly isolated from the world, while Australia looked nervously to the north at Japanese bases on New Guinea and the long double chain of the Solomon Islands, which threatened its lifeline to America. However, on August 7, 1942, exactly 8 months after Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had launched his aircraft carriers off Pearl Harbor, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal, marking the beginning of the counteroffensive. The celebratory war dance in Japan gradually transformed into a dirge as mournful drums beat a requiem of retreat and defeat. Smiling Japanese mothers no longer strolled through towns and cities, clutching their belts of 1,000 stitches, begging passers-by to sew a stitch into these magical charms for their soldier sons. Now those youths lay buried on distant islands, where admirals and generals akin to the despised Melanesian or Micronesian natives survived starvation by cultivating their own gardens of yams and sweet potatoes. The belts that had failed to protect the lives of the boys who wore them became battle souvenirs, second only to the samurai sabers of their fallen officers. This was the Japan that the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff still regarded as a formidable adversary, so formidable, in fact, that they believed it could be subdued only by an invasion force of 1 million men and thousands of ships, airplanes, and tanks. To achieve final victory, Okinawa was to be seized as a forward base for this enormous invading armada. In the fall of 1945, a three-pronged amphibious assault called Operation Olympic was planned against southern Kyushu, led by the 6th United States Army, which consisted of 10 infantry divisions and 3 spearheading Marine divisions. This would be followed in the spring of 1946 by Operation Coronet, a massive seaborne assault on the Tokyo Plain by the 8th and 10th Armies, spearheaded by another amphibious force of 3 Marine divisions, along with the 1st Army, which was to be transshipped from Europe to form a 10-division reserve. The entire operation would be under the command of General of the Armies Douglas MacArthur and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. Okinawa would serve as the launching point for this mightiest amphibious assault force ever assembled. Meanwhile, Japanese Imperial headquarters, still refusing to accept that Japan was defeated, continued to write reports through rose-colored glasses, anticipating an inevitable and bloody fight for Okinawa as a prelude to a titanic struggle for Japan itself. While the American Joint Chiefs viewed Operation Iceberg as one more stepping stone toward Japan, their enemies saw it as the anvil upon which the hammer blows of a still invincible Japan would crush the American fleet. The destruction of American sea power remained the chief objective of Japanese military policy. Sea power had allowed the Americans to traverse the island barriers that Imperial headquarters had deemed impenetrable, landing them at Iwo Jima, within the very prefecture of Tokyo, and now threatening to establish a foothold just 385 miles from the home islands. Only sea power could enable the invasion of Japan, an event that had not occurred in 3,000 years of Japan's recorded history and had only been attempted twice before, in 1274 and 1281. Kublai Khan, the grandson of the great Genghis Khan and Mongol Emperor of China, amassed huge invasion fleets on the Chinese coast for this purpose. Japan was unprepared to repel such colossal armadas, but a kamikaze, or divine wind, actually a typhoon, struck both Mongol fleets, scattering and sinking them. Nearly 7 centuries later, in early 1945, an entire host of divine winds emerged from Japan, the self-sacrificing bombers of the Special Attack Forces, the new kamikaze. They were so named because it was believed that they too would destroy another invasion fleet. This concept originated from Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and reflected the desperate measures Japan was willing to take to defend its territory. Admiral Takiro Onishi, who had led a carrier group during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, proposed to Fleet Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commander of Japan's combined fleet, the organization of a group of pilots who would deliberately crash dive-loaded bombers onto American warships. Toyoda agreed, as many Japanese found the concept of self-sacrifice popular in Japan, viewing it as a glorious method of defending the homeland and atoning for any failure. Consequently, Toyoda dispatched Onishi to the Philippines to begin organizing kamikaze operations on a local and volunteer basis. Then, following the American seizure of the Palau Islands and the invasion of the Philippines on October 15, 1944, Rear Admiral Masafumi Arima made the first kamikaze attempt, trying to crash dive the American carrier Franklin. He was shot down by Navy fighters, but Japanese Imperial headquarters falsely reported that he had succeeded in hitting the carrier, igniting the fervent aspirations of his fellow pilots. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred on October 25th, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where these self-sacrifice bombers delivered blows strong enough to alarm the Americans and signal the presence of a new weapon against them, though not powerful enough to devastate their forces. Too many kamikaze pilots missed their targets, crashed harmlessly into the ocean, got lost, or were shot down. Of the 650 self-terminators sent to the Philippines, Only about a quarter scored hits, primarily on small ships that lacked the firepower to defend themselves, rather than on cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers. Despite this, Imperial headquarters maintained a carefully curated narrative, announcing nearly 100% success. In reality, the generals and admirals privately estimated hits ranging from 12% to 50%, but they assumed that only battleships and carriers had been affected. Thus, the kamikaze was born amid a wave of national ecstasy and anticipated deliverance for the homeland. By January 1945, a significant corps of self-terminators had been organized under Vice Admiral Motome Ugaki and had become part of Japanese military strategy, if not the dominant element. Numerous self-terminators were ordered for operations, supported by first-class fighters and bombers tasked with clearing the skies of enemy interceptors and guiding the kamikaze to their targets. They needed guidance because many of the planes were older, stripped-down aircraft, and the pilots were often inexperienced. Admiral Ugaki opted not to use his newest planes or most skilled pilots, as Admiral Onishi had in the Philippines, believing it wasteful. He held that the spiritual power of the glorious, incomparable young Eagles would compensate for the firepower lacking in outdated aircraft, which often had their instruments removed. This attitude persisted even as perceptive Japanese commanders began to ridicule the bamboo spear tactics, which prioritized spiritual power over the realities of firepower. Ugaki showered his brave young volunteers with praise, intended to silence any reservations they may have had about flying these patched-up planes and to inspire the nation. The self-terminators were celebrated as heroes, often dining and being photographed before departing on their last missions. Farewell feasts were held in their honor at numerous airfields on the southernmost Japanese island of Kyushu, where solemn samurai ceremonies were conducted and many toasts of sake were raised. It did not seem to occur to the Japanese, especially Ugaki, that insobriety might impair the aim of the kamikaze and undermine their self-sacrifice mission. The concept of self-termination had captivated the nation from schoolgirls to Emperor Hirohito himself, so that even the slightest criticism would be deemed treasonous. This profound belief in the arrival of another divine wind dictated to the planners at Imperial headquarters how the Battle of Okinawa would be fought. The rapid pace with which the Americans were overrunning the Philippines generated a mood of deep pessimism at Imperial headquarters in Tokyo in late 1944. However, reports of kamikaze success in December and January transformed this despair into bright hopes. By 1945, headquarters had concluded that the United States would next target Okinawa to establish a base for the invasion of Japan proper. It was believed that the Kamikaze Corps could significantly enhance the chances for a successful defense of Okinawa and potentially prevent enemy landings on the home islands. Thus, a plan called Tenno, or Heavenly Operation, was devised. New armies were to be formed from military-age men who had been deferred for essential labor, and a powerful air force centered around the kamikaze would be organized to counter the Americans. More than 4,000 airplanes, both kamikaze and conventional, were to launch an all-out attack, supported by hundreds of self-termination motorboats operating from Okinawa and the Kurama Islands, followed by a final dash from Japan's remaining warships, including the mighty battleship Yamato. The air assaults were to originate from two directions: north from Formosa, where the Japanese Army's 8th Air Division and the Navy's 1st Air Fleet were based, and south from Kyushu, where a more robust force combined several Army and Navy commands, all under Vice Admiral Ugaki's direction. On February 6, the joint Army-Navy air agreement stated that, in general, Japanese air strength would be conserved until an enemy landing was imminent or within the defense sphere. Primary emphasis would be placed on the rapid activation, training, and mass deployment of the Special Attack Forces, or kamikaze. The main target for Army aircraft would be enemy transports, while Navy aircraft would focus on carrier attack forces. On the surface, this was a bold plan conceived in a spirit of cooperation. However, only those leaders who believed that the war could no longer be won were genuinely united in purpose. The Navy officers viewed this as the last opportunity to achieve a great redemptive victory, while the Army staff believed that the final battle would not take place on Okinawa, but rather on Kyushu. Their views were in conflict, yet their reasoning was sound. The sailors were certain that if air power could not stop the enemy at Okinawa, it would be equally ineffective on Kyushu. The army argued that even in the Philippines, the Americans had yet to confront a major Japanese army and that, devastated by the self-sacrifice of their defenders, they could be repulsed on Japanese soil. However, even the skeptics were convinced that, at the very least, a severe defeat must be inflicted on the Americans to compel the Allies to reconsider their demand for unconditional surrender. There was one more consideration, likely more evident to the Army than the Navy. The bamboo spear tactics were no longer viable. The illogical belief that spiritual power could triumph over firepower had contributed significantly to Japan's inability to halt the American advance across the Pacific. The doctrine of destroying enemy invaders at the water's edge had repeatedly resulted in disastrous frontal assaults, known as banzai charges, which left Japanese defenders so weakened that they were powerless to resist. Now a new spirit was emerging within the Japanese army, advocating for a defense in depth. Unlike the reckless banzai charges, which were costly in terms of attrition and often shattered under American fire, this new strategy was designed to be as difficult for the enemy to overcome as it was carefully planned. The aim was to inflict heavy losses on the Americans, thereby exhausting their resources and encouraging them to negotiate. The tactics of ambush and delay began to be implemented on the large island of Biak, located at the western extremity of New Guinea. This strategy was conceived by Colonel Kiyoshi Nakanishi, who commanded about 11,000 troops in the defense garrison. Disdainful of the doctrine of destruction at the water's edge, he decided to allow the Americans to come ashore unopposed, luring them into a trap. Nakanishi transformed the area around the vital airfield into a fortress, creating a network of caves and pillboxes that were mutually supportive and filled with riflemen, automatic weapons, artillery batteries, and light tanks. He also stockpiled these positions with sufficient ammunition, food, and water, an essential resource in Biak, where the heat and humidity took a toll equal to enemy gunfire. This preparation was intended to sustain his defense for months. When the 162nd Infantry of the 41st Division of the United States Army landed on Biak on May 27, 1944, they moved confidently inland, expecting little opposition until they reached the critical airfield. However, they were met with a fierce barrage from the low-lying terrain and ridges, pinning them to the ground. It wasn't until nightfall that Amtraks could extricate them from the ambush. There was no reckless banzai charge from the Japanese, which typically resulted in heavy casualties. Instead, the fighting on Biak turned into a grinding battle characterized by ambushes and delays. This pattern continued in battles at Peleliu and Iwo Jima, where the United States Marines expected swift victories within days or weeks, only to face months of staggering losses in both time and personnel. These were the tactics that Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima intended to employ on Okinawa with his defending Japanese 32nd Army upon his arrival there in August 1944. He dedicated himself to the challenging task of transforming the slender island into a fortress. In January 1945, he sent his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, to Tokyo for a review of his defenses. The planners at Imperial Headquarters were delighted with Ushijima's preparations, as they aligned perfectly with Tenno, the proposed ambush tactic. This approach was designed to lure the Americans within range of kamikaze attacks, both airborne and seaborne, to strike with such devastating force that the 32nd Army could then take the offensive and destroy the enemy. Upon returning to Okinawa, Isamu was eager for battle and excited to share the good news about Japan's devastating new weapon, the Divine Wind. To understand the samurai, a hereditary class of professional warriors unique to Japan, it is essential to grasp the history of Nippon, Japan, until 1853, when American Commodore Matthew Perry opened Japan to world trade. Until then, Nippon had been a hermit kingdom, a place where no foreigner would dare to venture if they valued their life. Between the founding of the island empire in 6060 BC and Perry's arrival, there had been a brief period of interaction with the West. This occurred when a storm drove a Portuguese ship bound for China ashore in 1543, leading to later ships bringing Catholic missionaries, including St. Francis Xavier, a significant Jesuit missionary and leader of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Under his influence, a large area of southern Kyushu converted to Catholicism, which displeased the ruling shoguns, military commanders who had seized power from the emperor, and the Buddhist priests. The shogun suspected the missionaries might be advanced scouts or spies for colonizing Catholic powers in Europe. They remembered that after Spanish priests arrived in the Philippines with Ferdinand Magellan, they were followed by Spanish soldiers who claimed the islands for the King of Spain. An uprising by Kyushu Christians was crushed with brutal severity, and in 1617 a persecution of Christians began. All Christians, whether foreign or Japanese, Protestant or Catholic, were ruthlessly hunted down, and those who did not recant under torture faced execution. Following this, Japan retreated into isolation, with no one allowed to leave the country under pain of death, and no foreigner permitted entry under the same grim penalty. No ocean-going ships were built, and every Japanese family was required to register at a Buddhist temple, with interest in Buddhist studies actively encouraged. Shinto, the indigenous nature worship and ancestor veneration of ancient Japan, was also revived. The term Shinto, derived from Chinese, reflects the influence of Chinese culture on Japan. Shinto is based on a simple reverence for awe-inspiring natural phenomena, such as waterfalls, splendid cloud formations, mountains, magnificent trees, or even oddly shaped stones. Places that evoked such delight or awe became Shinto shrines. At the pinnacle of this fundamentally shamanistic religion stood the divine emperor. Japanese tradition asserts that the imperial family is directly descended from the sun goddess. In reality, this lineage stems from the Yamato clan, which claims the sun goddess as its progenitor. During the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Yamato clan's priest chiefs gained suzerainty, effectively unifying the country without dismantling the rights of other clans. Consequently, this ruling family could claim an antiquity unmatched by any other reigning families in the world. They could also assert the allegiance of their subjects unto death. To fail or embarrass the emperor was considered a heinous, unforgivable crime, for which there was no penance or atonement other than self-destruction. This belief in the divinity of the emperor was skillfully and cynically exploited by the shogun, who ruled the country through the emperor as a figurehead. The shogun rose to power after the imperial armies suffered setbacks against Japan's original inhabitants, the Ainu, an extremely hairy race subsequently exiled to the inhospitable north by the often hairless Japanese, who contemptuously referred to them as the hairy Ainu. Disdaining the imperial conscripts, the shogun formed their own smaller yet better trained and disciplined armies. These forces were led by a new class of officers drawn from the sons of local clan chiefs known as samurai, who established this new hereditary warrior class. The samurai were a class of professional warriors serving the daimyos, or feudal lords. They were easily distinguished by their unique hairstyles, shaven at the front with the hair knotted at the top, and by the clan badge worn on their kimonos. Living Spartan lives, they were rigorously trained from childhood to manhood in self-control. A samurai was taught to show neither joy nor anger and was never to engage in trade or handle money. Like Christian seminarians, he held commerce in contempt, viewing it as beneath his dignity. In addition to their moral training, samurai were expected to excel in martial arts. The 2 swords they wore, one long and one short, were badges of rank. Samurai were particularly expected to master the long 2-handed sword, a thick, heavy, single-edged saber that was extremely sharp. The short sword was used for decapitating a fallen enemy or for committing seppuku, more commonly known as harakiri, a ritualistic suicide performed in atonement for failure or disgrace. To execute this, a samurai would kneel on the floor and thrust the short sword into his stomach, twisting it in a ceremonial manner. If the pain became unbearable, a comrade could end his suffering by striking his neck with a saber, severing the spinal column. A lifetime of cultivating indifference to pain was part of a samurai's code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. This inevitably arrogant warrior class was permitted to kill any commoner who behaved in a manner that did not meet their expectations. The shogun ruled Japan, and their reign continued for over 2 centuries after the extinction of Christianity. It ended only when Commodore Perry arrived in his steam-driven black ships, which terrified the insular Japanese as they saw these vessels moving effortlessly against the wind in Tokyo Bay. A treaty quickly followed, opening 2 ports to American trade. This unprecedented deference to a foreign power enraged conservatives across various sectors, including merchants, daimyos, and samurai, leading to a revolution known as the Meiji Restoration. This revolution ended the power of the shogun and restored authority to the emperor, culminating the samurai's career. No ruler could feel entirely safe with such dangerous zealots at large, and thus, by imperial edict, these fierce warriors accepted a lump sum termination to hang up their swords and transition into roles as merchants, lawyers, doctors, or bureaucrats. However, they did not remain suppressed for long. The Meiji Restoration marked perhaps the most astonishing national turnaround in history, embracing the entire apparatus of the once despised Western civilization, everything invented or developed by the West since ancient Greece and Rome, including science, industry, culture, political institutions, methods of education, business practices, economics, dress, and even sports. This influx of foreign ideas was sometimes amusing to Westerners, who observed smaller Japanese individuals donning tuxedos and top hats, which seemed ill-fitting and reminiscent of scarecrow attire. Yet the change was only superficial. Japan, despite its pretensions to democracy, remained a paternalistic authoritarian state. Although the secret police, organized in the 1600s, may have been disbanded, they were replaced by thought police, spies, and informants who diligently sought out sedition and suspicious activities, empowered like the samurai of old to execute anyone caught deviating from accepted norms. In classrooms and army barracks, young Japanese were indoctrinated to glorify Nippon's military traditions and to believe that dying on the battlefield for the emperor was the most sublime fate to which a man could aspire. Inevitably, the spirit of the samurai returned, and their code of Bushido was revived. Soldiers of a predominantly peasant army, both officers and men, were trained in the rigorous, selfless samurai tradition, taught to see themselves as heirs to that noble warrior class. Officers adopted a so-called samurai saber, similar to the two-handed longsword of old, as their badge of rank. Properly sharpened, this weapon could sever a prisoner's head in a single stroke. The summary execution of captives, often following torture for information, became one of the least gruesome features of Japan's new samurai-led army, as it took the field in pursuit of territorial conquest and the raw materials and markets in which Nippon, as a modern industrial nation, was woefully deficient. Eventually, the chief officers among them emerged as Japan's warlords, colluding with zaibatsu, powerful business conglomerates, leading politicians, bureaucrats, and industrialists such as the Mitsubishi and Mitsui families. These warlords ruled the country through the figurehead of Emperor Hirohito. This territorial expansion by an authoritarian coalition began in 1879 with Japan's annexation of the Ryukyu Islands, of which Okinawa was the largest. 66 years later, 3 typical samurai were tasked with defending this last barrier between American armed forces and the home islands of Japan. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, epitomized the samurai ideal. He was ramrod straight, lean, and sharp-featured, sporting a graying military brush mustache. He commanded respect from his subordinates through his unshakable composure and iron self-control, yet he was also a considerate man whose staff not only respected him but even revered him. Ushijima's style was low-key. He abstained from the rough and tumble of staff discussions on policy, plans, or operations, where officers sometimes clashed violently, as had happened during the Guadalcanal disaster. Instead, he allowed his aides to make decisions that he would either approve or reject, always taking responsibility for the results, whether good or bad. In their unreserved admiration for him, his idolizing staff compared him to Takamori Saigo, a celebrated hero of the Meiji Restoration. Early in the war, Ushijima had distinguished himself as an infantry group commander during the conquest of Burma, where he met Isamu Cho, chief of staff of the Southern Army. They returned to Tokyo together, Ushijima to become commandant of the Japanese Military Academy, and Cho to serve in the General Military Affairs Bureau. They also arrived in Okinawa together, Ushijima as the 32nd's chief and Cho as his chief of staff. The two men could not have differed more in character. Ushijima, the serene commander, inspired his subordinates and possessed the rare gift of recognizing his own incapacities, which he compensated for by choosing Major General Cho, a firebrand planner and organizer who was strict yet resourceful. Cho was aggressive and so explosively argumentative that he was often unpopular. Deceptively scholarly in appearance, with wide spectacles that exaggerated his owlish features, he was, in stark contrast to the Spartan Ushijima, a bon vivant. Even toward the end of the battle for Okinawa, he could be found enjoying unrivaled meals, the best Scotch whiskey, the finest sake, and the company of attractive women. The burly Cho was also something of a bully, and the young officers who served him resented his hectoring tirades, even though they admitted that he could make them work harder than any other officer. Isamu Cho had risen to the rank of lieutenant general at age 51 and was in line for another star. In 1930, while a captain, he joined the Sakurakai, or Cherry Society, whose approximately 100 members, all firebrands like Cho, were sworn to cleanse Japan of all Western influences that they considered detrimental to the ancient virtues of the samurai. This anti-democratic and anti-capitalistic organization sought to establish a military dictatorship, adopting the cherry tree as their emblem. The emblem of the Cherry Society, named after the cherry blossom's brilliant yet fleeting flowers, symbolized the samurai's readiness to die for the emperor at any moment. Eager to embrace the dictatorial mantle, some generals sought favor from this society, thereby contributing to its rising influence and to Isamu Cho's emergence as its leading advocate. In January 1931, he was involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the prime minister and replace him with a prominent general. However, this distinguished officer declined the honor, seemingly preferring to attain such prominence through legal means. In October, the Cherry Society attempted another coup, once again led by Cho. The plan involved revolutionaries flying over Tokyo to bomb select targets, chief among them the prime minister's residence. With the prime minister dead, Emperor Hirohito would be compelled to appoint a general as his successor. However, Cho's exuberance ultimately foiled the plot. At one meeting in a geisha house in Tokyo's red light district, he proclaimed that the conspiracy must succeed, even if it required threatening the emperor with a drawn dagger. This treasonous remark prompted a fellow member to blow the whistle, leading the Japanese military police to raid the geisha house and arrest the ringleaders, although Cho himself was not among them. Rather than facing punishment, Cho was rewarded with a prestigious assignment to the Kwantung Army, which was engaged in forcibly extracting Manchuria from the weakened Chinese Empire. The public at that time was not as outraged as one might expect over the brocade banner affair. During this period, a man could often excuse his misdeeds by cloaking himself in the mantle of patriotism, and might even be forgiven for considerable wrongdoing. However, as militarists tightened their grip on Japan, any form of opposition to the status quo, regardless of its purported patriotism, became increasingly intolerable. Nonetheless, Cho's impulsiveness nearly sparked a war between Japan and the Soviet Union in 1938, when he, along with another officer, ordered an unauthorized attack on Soviet forces just over the Manchurian border. 3 years later, as chief of staff of the army that had seized Thailand, he seemingly incited hostilities between Thai and Vichy French troops. Yet, despite these reckless actions, he retained the inexplicable favor of high command, much to the chagrin of senior generals who also sought the Okinawa assignment. Perhaps imperial headquarters believed that Cho's overwhelming zeal could be more advantageous than detrimental. If his fervor could rekindle the soldiers' spirits on Okinawa, Then a new type of kamikaze might overwhelm American firepower and save Japan. This potential thought may have occupied the minds of the mystical Japanese generals and admirals who genuinely believed that the spirit of the samurai lived on, fighting for the emperor, and would forever reside in Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. However, in terms of tangible leadership, a more promising figure emerged in Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, Chief Planning Officer of the 32nd Army. At 42, Yahara was significantly younger than both USI Jima and Cho, yet his record was almost as impressive. Graduating from the Japanese Military Academy in the class of 1923, he had served in an infantry regiment, attended the Japanese War College, and spent 10 months at Fort McCoy in the United States as an exchange officer. He had also served with distinction during conflicts in China, Thailand, Malaya, and Burma. Tall for a Japanese, Yahara exuded an air of superiority, likely stemming from his disdain for those advocating primitive bamboo spear tactics. This attitude alienated many of his comrades, particularly Cho. The two men were as different as night and day. Where Cho was impetuous, Yahara was deliberate. Where Cho was physical and aggressive, Yahara was thoughtful and careful. Where Cho was driven by emotion, Yahara relied on intellect. For Yahara, war was not merely a contest but a science, one to be won through superior tactics adapted to the terrain, weapons, and troops, rather than through reckless and bloody banzai charges. Despite his intellectualism and the aloofness it bred, along with his open contempt for those lacking his acumen, Yahara's rationalism complemented USI Jima's charisma and Cho's fervor, conferring upon the 32nd Army exceptional leadership. This trio was now committed to a new strategy of defense in depth, executed on the most suitable terrain, which did not promise a quick and easy victory for American forces. Their intention was to cede no ground willingly and to exhaust the enemy, reflected in the 32nd Army's slogan devised by USI Jima: "One plane for one warship, one boat for one ship, one man for 10 of the enemy, or one tank." The fulfillment of the first part of this slogan rested with the kamikaze, as General USI Jima had little air power based on Okinawa's 5 airfields. One boat for one ship would be achieved through naval divine winds by sea-raiding squadrons. These were youthful recruits fresh out of high school, trained to ram explosive-laden motorboats into American ships. Approximately 700 suicide boats were hidden in the Ryukyu Islands, with around 350 stationed only 15 miles west of southern Okinawa in the islands of the Kurorama-Retto. The third part of the strategy was left to a force of about 100,000 men, of whom 1/5 were conscripted from the Okinawan population. The bulk of these troops was concentrated in the southern third of Okinawa, where USI Jima began constructing a defensive line facing north, resembling a broad arrowhead. Its point rested on the heights surrounding Shuri and Shui Castle, the city and citadel of Okinawa's ancient kings. Its flanks extended to the sea on either side, through a jungle of ridges to Naha, the chief city, on the left and back toward Yara Airfield on the right. This was the Naha-Shuri-Yara line, holding the majority of USI Jima's fighting forces: the 62nd Division, which had served in China, the 24th Division, and the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade. To the left, on the Ru Peninsula jutting into the sea west of Naha, were about 3,500 Japanese sailors and 7,000 civilians under Vice Admiral Minoru Ota. Roughly 3,000 soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Unit under Colonel Takahiko Udo occupied the uninhabited northern half of Okinawa, an area that USI Jima, at Yahara's urging, had chosen not to defend. He also did not intend to contest the Haoshi beaches in west-central Okinawa, instead opting to defend the Minoga beaches to the south since they lay behind his Naha-Shuri-Yara line. He would protect almost nothing north of that line, aside from its approaches, including Yontan and Kadena airfields to the east of the Haoshi beaches, which would be destroyed the moment the Americans arrived by a special force drawn from the Boai, the home guard of about 20,000 men. USI Jima had ruthlessly conscripted these Okinawan males aged between 20 and 40. This wrecking crew was known as the Bimbo Pai, or poor detachment, a title resented by the Japanese soldiers whose growing disdain for Okinawa and its people had already posed a challenge for General USI Jima. The conscription of the Boai inadvertently led to one of the primary complaints among USI Jima's soldiers, a lack of fresh vegetables. There were not enough adult males available to cultivate the usual vegetable crops during the fall and winter, and Tokyo was shipping bullets, not beans. "I cannot endure having just a cup of rice for a meal with no side dishes at all," one soldier lamented. "Our health will be ruined." This sentiment was frequently echoed, and USI Jima took note by urging his men to display a more resolute spirit, hold fast to the belief in victory, and always remember the spirit of martyrdom and the honor of dying for the good of the country. As consolation, the general issued each man a pint and a half of sweet potato brandy, declared a temporary amnesty for drunkards, and promised another distribution on April 29, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito would celebrate his 44th birthday. Cho returned from his visit to Tokyo in late January.